Weeding is a major task in a vegetable garden, often requiring more time than any other job we need to do during the growing season. And ineffective weeding is one of the big reasons why crops fail, and so many people seem to give up growing vegetables because of it. I have seen so many vegetable gardens that are overwhelmed by weeds, and I have seen a lot of crops in my own garden struggle over the years, or produce a lot less than they could have because of competition from these unwanted plants. We have become a lot better at reducing the weed pressure in the gardens by using different growing methods and being a lot more consistent with the weeding that we have to do. But we still struggle with some perennial weeds and have used a few different methods to keep them out of the vegetable gardens. I think there are 3 types of weeds in our gardens, each requiring different strategies to deal with. Annual weeds are perhaps the most common, which sprout from the dormant seeds in the soil, seeds that have blown in on the wind, or seeds that we brought in with the compost. And perhaps the most common source of these types of weed seeds is when we let weeds and even our vegetable plants go to seed in the gardens, dumping thousands of seeds into the soil, many of which will sprout the next year. In the gardens that we have regularly cultivated or dug over, the bank of dormant seeds have largely been depleted from the soil over the years, and not letting any plants go to seed in the gardens has prevented the seed supplies from building back up. And with fewer flowering weed and crop plants being added to the compost, there are fewer seeds surviving that can germinate when the compost is eventually added back onto the gardens. We are also using reduced tilling methods in more of the garden spaces, which prevents a new batch of seeds being brought to the surface where they can germinate. And I've been buying a lot of municipal compost that is free of weed seeds to use as a mulch, which can also suppress the germination of a lot of the seeds that do remain in the soil. Regular hoeing of the larger parts of the gardens, using wire weeders around the plants, hand weeding when necessary, and occasionally flame weeding empty beds deals with any of the weeds that do germinate and keeps the gardens largely weed-free. So we have been adapting methods we use to manage the gardens, been trying to prevent new weed seeds from being produced or imported, and have tried to be consistent with regular weeding. And all of this has resulted in a gradual reduction year on year of the amount of weed seeds that appear in the gardens. And this type of weed is no longer the problematic issue that it used to be. The second type of weed that we deal with are really just seedlings that have grown bigger and are harder to kill. Most of the weeds or unwanted plants that we miss and have become established in the gardens, or that we want to get rid of when clearing new ground, can be removed by either pulling them out of the soil or cutting them off at the top of the root. But plants like docks and dandelions will easily regrow from the remains of the strong taproot left in the soil. This tendency, and the fact that these plants pull up nutrients from deep within the soil, can be useful in some contexts, where we can regularly cut off the above ground portion of the plant as it regrows. This type of chop and drop strategy can be a useful way of building fertility and organic matter on the surface of the soil, so long as we don't let any of these strong weeds develop seeds. But we tend to dig most of these deep-rooted plants out of the gardens, or cover individual plants with a flat rock or a piece of board heavy and wide enough to prevent the regrowth of the plant. This works because these types of plants don't grow or spread horizontally, and as long as we prevent them from forming flowers, we don't have to worry about these types of weeds taking over the gardens. The third type of weed, and the hardest to deal with, are the ones that do spread horizontally. Plants like creeping buttercups do this by sending out runners to establish new plants, similar to a strawberry plant, and nettle plants can do something similar. But because the runners are above ground, these plants are relatively easy to remove. But the plants that spread horizontally through underground root systems are much more difficult to manage. We have to regularly deal with 3 types of common weeds that spread like this: the creeping thistle, scotchgrass, and bindweed, as well as raspberry plants that have escaped a few of the allotments in the area. We have successfully dug out very established patches of these plants, but it takes repeated digging over several months to finally remove all of the broken pieces of root that can regrow, or to find the roots that are buried so deeply. And we have used ground cover fabric to smother plants in a larger area, but I generally find that 2 layers of this type of permeable plastic barrier is needed to exclude enough light and to prevent the thin leaves of the scotchgrass from finding their way up through the material. And it takes at least a year to do that in our climate, and we still need to check to make sure that all the plants are dead, and occasionally need to dig out the remains of bindweed or scotchgrass plants to fully clear the space. And at the edges of the covered areas, the interconnected rhizome network of roots can extend quite far, keeping the roots alive under the cover for a long time. In the gardens that we regularly dig over, I found it fairly easy to dig out and remove small patches of these weeds, but I've had less success in getting rid of these types of weeds using layers of cardboard and a mulch of compost or other biomass. When first establishing the no-dig garden, I didn't use enough layers of cardboard or overlap them enough, and patches of scotch grass persisted in this garden for a few years. And then the raspberry plants from the overgrown adjacent allotment also migrated across the overgrown path and started to appear in this garden. Thankfully, there isn't any bindweed or a lot of creeping thistle in this area, both of which don't seem to be able to thrive in the grassed areas that are regularly mowed, which is also a good way to keep back the spread of raspberry canes if a wide enough path is mowed frequently enough. I tried to smother areas with more cardboard a few times, which did help a bit and prevented the patches from spreading too much, but I eventually resorted to carefully digging out the remaining roots whenever I found them. It took a while, but eventually the persistent patches were eliminated from this garden. Getting these types of weeds out of the gardens is one thing, but preventing them from growing in from the edges of the gardens is another factor that has taken me a while to figure out how to successfully manage. The family scale gardens are located in a shared allotment area and are surrounded by strips of grass walkways that are publicly accessible that also contain a fair amount of scotch grass. I could use a barrier of some kind and a lot of wood chip to establish a weed-free perimeter of permanent paths around each of the gardens. But this is not really appropriate in my context, and I'm not sure I want to invest in all the time and resources that this would take. So I have to find a way to deal with the fact that there are grasses and other plants that will grow into the gardens along the surface of the soil, and scotch grass and raspberry plants that will come in underground, as all of these plants are attracted to the higher fertility and occasionally open spaces of the garden beds. I used to use a sharp spade to cut deep into the soil to re-establish the edge of the garden beds, removing the growth on the surface and hopefully severing the underground root systems. But I had to do this a few times a year and still had to deal with the regrowth from the pieces of root that I would have chopped off that remained underground. A few years ago, we started to cut a vertical wedge along the perimeter of the garden and to line this with strips of reused thick polytunnel plastic. And this method has been more successful than I had expected. But we do need to make sure that the plastic is buried deep enough and the separate sheets of plastic are overlapped enough to form an effective barrier to keep out the expanding network of scotch grass roots. And if we keep the plastic slightly above the surface of the soil, it is reasonably effective at slowing down the encroachment of grasses along the surface. This top edge of the plastic does have a tendency to be pushed over and partially buried by the surrounding grass and when we walk on it, so it does need to be cleared and re-established occasionally. But this task of regular maintenance is a lot less work, and the plastic barrier is a lot more successful than the other methods that I've tried of preventing these problematic weed roots from colonizing the garden beds. This type of barrier is not perfect, of course, and the root system of these plants can go down under the plastic. This is what happened with one of our larger polytunnels that I had initially cleared of all the weeds about 5 years ago, soon after it was put up. But I didn't clear these perennial weeds from around the perimeter of this polytunnel, and the roots of creeping thistle and bindweed made it under the edge of the polytunnel plastic that had been buried in the trench. We have dug out a few sections where these plants had colonized the inside of the polytunnel, and we tried to pull out any shoots whenever they appear, but we haven't been so consistent with this, and now these weeds are fairly established in a few areas. And they still seem to be connected to the larger root systems outside the polytunnel, which seems to be transferring nutrients and energy into the roots inside that allows them to continue to regrow. We're going to have to dig out a few sections and cover parts of the growing beds with fabric or cardboard to eliminate the bindweed and creeping thistle inside this polytunnel, especially when the roots are too deep to effectively dig out. And we also need to get rid of the weeds outside of the polytunnel so that this regrowth doesn't happen again. For the past year, we have used a double layer of ground cover fabric to clear the entire area on one side of this polytunnel to establish new beds. So most of the bindweed is gone, we just need to dig out a few small remaining patches. But on the other side, and at the ends of the polytunnel, the narrow strip of ground cover fabric I had laid down as a barrier a few years ago has been completely overgrown because of my neglect. And it was obviously not wide enough to prevent the creeping thistle from finding its way into the polytunnel space. So we are working to recover this space for a whole year with a wider double layer of fabric, making sure that we carefully push the edge of the fabric in beside the polytunnel plastic to reduce the chance of weeds growing at this edge. With the new polytunnel we put up last year, we were more careful about establishing a buffer zone around the outside. And we had completely dug over and sieved the soil on the inside of this polytunnel, removing a lot of the root systems of these plants. But there are still some pieces of bindweed and scotchgrass left in the soil. There always are. We had covered the full area of the inside of this polytunnel with a layer of cardboard before adding a thick layer of compost mulch. But this didn't prevent the regrowth of some of these root fragments. It is amazing to see how long some of the shoots will grow from such a small piece of root, looking for a path between the layers of cardboard. We tried to remove these growing shoots when they first appeared above the compost, but once we had transplanted plants into this polytunnel, we were a bit more cautious about digging around as we didn't want to damage the root systems of the crops too much. So there are still some plants that have survived the full year, even though we were able to prevent them from becoming really established and sending out a lot of new roots. I decided to delay planting in this polytunnel earlier this spring to make sure that we could find and dig out all of the remaining roots before the summer crops are planted. And hopefully we will be able to keep this valuable growing space free of these perennial weeds. The strategies that we use for managing most weeds is to prevent a lot more seeds from being produced or imported. And I have found that weeding quite frequently often ends up being the easier thing to do. So most kinds of weeds aren't a big issue in our growing spaces anymore, but it did take a few years and better management practices to get to this point. With the more problematic weeds like bindweed, scotchgrass, and creeping thistle, I have become a lot less tolerant, as I know how long it can take to dig out these root systems once they become established, and I've learned that the hard way. My general strategy now in dealing with these types of weeds is to set up a barrier or buffer zone between the growing spaces and the rest of the surrounding landscape that is not fully cultivated yet. Then we work to eliminate these weeds from inside that barrier and make sure we maintain that buffer zone, including digging out some areas to break the connecting network of roots that might go under that buffer zone. And in the areas where I'm still developing new growing spaces, I want to gradually expand from the existing areas that are weed-free by slowly pushing that perimeter buffer zone further out. Making sure that any weeds that do regrow inside this perimeter are quickly removed or covered for long enough so that they don't get established, and to try not to plant anything until I'm sure that the remaining weeds can be dealt with. Or at least that is the plan, but we have to make sure that we don't take on too much, because if we don't have the time to deal with these plants when they're still quite small, they can quickly take over, and then that means that we might have to start all over again.